Welcome to Windows on the World. In another week of climate change and propaganda, the BBC have also had Brian Cox versus Malcolm Roberts. This was a big thing in Australia, and this Malcolm Roberts is a senator. And just for people who haven't heard of him, he's part of the One Nation Party in Australia, and he's being derided all over the place. He's done a lot of research into climate change, and that's one of the reasons why he wanted to actually go into the Parliament. It says on their website, Malcolm's climate investigations led to deep understanding of the foreign control wrecking our country and to clarity on the tax system now choking Australians and destroying initiative and responsibility while sabotaging our children's future. Now, this programme was very much aimed at our children's future and being bought into global warming, massive taxation and the whole thing. But we're also being told that this summer is the hottest summer on record. I'm with Piers Corbin, and we're going to just open up with Piers.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, first of all, this claim that this is the hottest summer on record is a lie. They are manipulating data and have been systematically doing so since 1990. You can go on our website and you can see, using their own data, which they then re-engineer, shows that they have increased world temperatures relative to the last 50 years or so by half a degree. In other words, there's nothing warmer about now compared with the warm spell in the late 1930s and 1940s. And this programme in particular was aimed at undermining Malcolm Roberts, who's a highly competent, very intelligent man who's gone into Parliament in order to put a halt on the globalisation agenda, which is impoverishing the middle and lower classes in Australia and the whole world. And his specific points about climate are very well researched, and he understands them extremely well, which is why they are totally scared of him and why the whole programme there was aimed at undermining him. But he stood up to questioning very well, and Brian Cox, the so-called scientist expert, explicitly lied on Australian television about the role of carbon dioxide. He said that carbon dioxide controls world temperatures and showed a graph. Well, the graph is fraud, and the fact in 600 million years of world data and estimates show that in history and prehistory it is average carbon dioxide levels which are controlled by the temperature of the ocean, because the ocean dictates how much CO2 goes in and out of it, and that is dictated by temperature. And there's 50 times more CO2 in the ocean than in the atmosphere. So man's contribution of 4% of this total flux is a trivial piffle which has no influence whatsoever and is not evidenced at all in the data. However, they have another agenda, namely redistribution of wealth around the world and so forth. But the explicit points made at that meeting, that interview, were, for example, they claimed there was a 97% consensus in support of man-made climate change. Well, for a start, consensus is not science, and that is actually irrelevant. There was a 99.99% consensus against Galileo, but fortunately Galileo didn't just give up.
Fortunately, there were probably people around him.
But the 97%, the real figure is actually 7%. If you look at the papers surveyed to produce that 97%, most of those people just put climate change in a headline when they're measuring the speed of snails under different carbon dioxide concentrations, and said they were helping towards research into climate change. Well, they may or may not have been, but that's what they put in the headline.
Right.
And
the thing with
Piers, they're called climate change supporters.
Yes.
And they weren't.
What we're being told all the time is the science is settled, and this is absolute rubbish. And even a layperson can look that up and find out that to be the case. Now,
science is never settled.
Of course it's not. But climate, especially with the climate that's constantly evolving and changing. But with ClimateGate, we found out that the IPCC was part of a massive fraud. Now, that seems to have been conveniently forgotten, that they fiddled the data. Yeah. This is scientific fraud. So this Brian Cox is standing on the back of scientific fraud. Is that too harsh?
No, that is absolutely correct. And this, of course, is used to make all sorts of claims to frighten the young. Like this being the hottest year ever. Well, every year they've been saying this is the hottest year ever. All of these claims for the last decade have been lies. The data has been manipulated and the temperatures increased by about 0.5 degree compared with the past. There are interesting things happening now. For example, we've got this heat wave in Britain, which we predicted. And there was also some frosts in Scotland, which are all part of this. Actually, they're part of the wild jet stream, which brings alternating hot and cold spells. And these extremes are the wrong type of extremes for the man-made climate change story, which requires the jet stream just to shift northwards, and it would be generally, on average, over the globe warmer. But actually, the jet stream has moved south and is moving wildly, which is a different scenario from those predicted. And if you go on weatheraction.com, you can see we explain all of this.
Yes. Also, what I wanted to bring up was the graph that he used and threw at Malcolm Roberts, as though Malcolm Roberts was some kind of idiot and hadn't taken in this information, which was part of the settled science. Can you go into that?
Yes, the graph showed increases in temperature of surface measurements. Those surface measurements are redefined every year, and the graph is fraud. Because if you don't do redefining, then you find it is a flat graph. If you look at, or a decreasing graph currently, if you look at actual observations from satellites, then you can see that all the estimates of the man-made climate change theory have failed, and the world is now cooling.
One thing I wanted to bring up, Piers, was we were at a conference earlier this year, the Climate Change Challenge, and it's coming up again later this year,
That's
quite
right.
soon actually.
That's
But what people I think need to realise is that some of these people who were originally working for the IPCC are so disgusted with what's happened that they're no longer allowed to be part of it because they don't want to go along with the consensus data. And that is something I don't think the public are aware of.
No, they're not. The climate change delusion story is now getting desperate. They know their science has failed, so they're busy rallying whatever they can. And basically the BBC and the Australian broadcasting operation try and imply that every extreme is caused by man-made climate change and carbon dioxide. Actually, there are some very extreme events now, but they are caused by the wild jet stream, which we explicitly predicted years ago. Last week I was in an important little event in Norway, run by the Norway Climate Realists, where we were talking about the climate change campaign now, and basically we see ourselves as part of the revolution against political and academic establishments around the world who work together in order to control and actually lower the income levels of the middle classes. We're following on, this conference in Norway has been followed on the September the 8th and 9th in London in a climate truth conference, if you like, and if you go on our website weatheraction.com you can get all the details. And in that we will be slaughtering the sacred cows of climate change delusion.
I think people who have been brainwashed up to a certain extent with this stuff and maybe starting to see through it should go to geoethic.com as well, where these scientists...
It's the same operation, but
exactly, it's the same conference.
The website. Yes,
it's the same conference, but we've had Niels Axel Morn on here as one of the world leading experts in sea levels.
Absolutely.
And what's very, very...
And he's the main convener.
What's very disappointing about this is that when you get someone of that calibre talking on YouTube, it gets very, very few hits because it's not mainstream media propaganda, and that is what we need to break down, isn't it? So how are we going to do this, though? Because they've got a real stranglehold, and they keep bringing on these neoliberals saying this is for our children. It's a totally well manufactured scam that's being engineered for very nefarious ends. And we've covered that on this show quite a lot about Agenda 21 or Agenda 2030. All of the things that are happening as part of local green policy, for instance, are denying people their rights on the back of a complete lie. And this is why I'm bloody furious about it. So how can we convince people, Piers?
Well, we have to go for the facts. And, you know, through alternative media, we should hammer away at explicit lies, such as by Brian Cox, and call these people to account. Because in the long run, what they're doing is anti-scientific. Anyway, I mean, it's going to lead nowhere good. What they're up to, it's just going to lead to impoverishment of middle and lower classes, and the super rich getting richer and richer. And this has to stop. Okay, mechanisms, how do we get there? Well, there's a lot of things, but you have to talk to people, but essentially we've got to build the alternative media and force the mainstream media to actually carry proper, honest, accountable debate, which they refuse to do. But, you know, we need to have a demonstration, or many demonstrations, to bring the BBC into account. I mean, the BBC board should be elected. Now, if it was elected, we wouldn't have so many lies shoveled upon us. We would have an accountable setup. That is what we need.
Well, exactly. I mean, they're a huge part of it, but that Australian broadcaster was equally as guilty because they did the usual dirty tricks that the BBC use. Yeah. You know, it's all the same thing. We're being guilt-tripped into an agenda, and they're telling us, so you don't believe NASA and you don't believe the IPCC. Well, exactly.
NASA lies. NASA is busy manufacturing. Look, they're paid for the American government in order to propagate certain things. I mean, for example, I did one quite big conference. I was told by people from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which is the top people who make the rockets and so forth, which, you know, do American space research. They said, Mr. Corbin, we want to invite you along to a meeting. I said, great, but I heard nothing from them. I saw the people next year, and I was told, people in charge put the lid on it. Sorry. And the reason is, of course, I'd be there talking science against the climate change delusion. But this is not what the American government want to hear.
Yeah, well, look, the thing is that there's a lot of very well orchestrated and well placed puppets in place that are doing the dirty work of people with a very nefarious agenda, and that's what the public will never get their heads around until they see it happening to them, and that is increasingly starting to happen.
It is.
Where they're finding that remedy is taken away from them at a local level, and it's all on the back of this. It's all on the back of this fraud when it comes down to it, because all of the policies with the housing and the social cleansing all go back to green policies that were instigated by councils about 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. And we've covered this on many shows.
Yeah.
So final word, Piers?
If you're working or at school or running a family, all of you look at the facts.
That's it from Windows on the World for this section. We'll see you very soon. Keep watching those, watching us, watching them, watching the climate, and keep the climate changing. See you next time.